Alright, what is up YouTube? So today we got a banned list and it was pretty minimalistic, but it was pretty big because Kashtira, a Rise Heart is banned, as well as Bestial Magnemite in Chaos Space. So Dragon Link and Kashtira both receive hits on the ban list, but everything else seemed to, stay untouched. And even Salamangreat got 3 Gazelle back, and I guess whatever Orange Light helps, I guess that, that came back. So let's just get started with the tier list. The first deck is Unchained. Unchained is undoubtedly tier 1. I don't see this changing because this deck is very hard to interact. There's not many good cards against this deck in terms of staple cards. Besides, like, maybe Change of Heart. Marionette Might is like a variant of Change of Heart. There's just not much else. Like, I guess Bestial Druisworm is probably decent against the matchup, but not really. It's kind of like Tierlist. Tierlist was very hard to interact with, besides like the Bestials and DD Crow, etc, etc. So it just gives me that same type of vibe where Unchained is just so hard to interact with, and the deck just plays through a lot. It not only just, it's hard to interact with, but they have so many extenders, so many ways to play, so many different lines. So Unchained is definitely a tier 1 deck and is probably going to be the best deck for a while. Labyrinth is a tier 2 deck. It didn't receive any hits on the ban list. This deck was still pretty solid in the format, even though it's not seen that much. Maybe with Unchained it is. But Labyrinth, it does have a weird Unchained matchup, which is probably a reason to put it in tier 3 maybe. But I still think Labyrinth does well against pretty much every single deck on this tier list, which makes it tier 2 at best. Now, speaking of a trap deck that is bad, Poltergeist is trash. The deck, it tries to be a combo deck when it's a control deck, and it just doesn't work out. Like, it's just 2-card combos. You have some 1-card combos with Melee Seek, but that's about it. It's just really bad Labyrinth at the end of the day. Labyrinth just does it better. And then there's so many other control decks that do what Poltergeist is trying to do, but better. For Hire Runic, this deck is pretty solid, but the thing is, the Runic cards are not really good against Unchained, which I'm going to just put in tier 3. And also, I don't know. I feel like putting this in tier 2, but it's just Unchained is such a very bad matchup for this deck. And Unchained, or Runic, has a really bad matchup into combo decks because I feel like Infernobles, Manatium, Tier Laments are going to be very, very, very good in this format. So something like Runic is just not going to be that great. So yeah, I think Runic is still pretty fine. Like, Runic variants, I might as well just put Live Twin and For Hire in the same category, because I think overall they're just kind of the same deck but like different play styles. So I definitely do think Runic is a good deck, but it just doesn't match up with some of these like decks in the format. Plunder, it's a pretty solid rogue deck. It's just one of those decks to where you can play a good amount of non-engine and it plays through a lot. Once it gets growing, it's just kind of hard to stop in a sense. But I guess the main issue with the deck is that sometimes you just can't get started, or you don't have many Plunder patrols, so it's just hard to get your engine rolling. So Plunder's still pretty decent. There's not much to say about it. Heroes, they still have the same gimmick, summon Dark Law, summon Plasma, summon any of these like pretty strong monsters, DPE, etc, etc. The combo is still the same. You still have the spell lock with the I forget the name, the level 1. But overall, deck's still pretty solid, I guess. I mean, it's just Heroes. It hasn't really changed. Next up, we have the 3 Cyberser decks, which is Salamangreat, Marincess, and Mathmech. I think that Marincess is probably better out of the 3, but I think that Salamangreat is super consistent right now, which is like really good. I think they're all kind of on the same level. I think Mathmech is like the worst one over them, although it could be a little bit better. And the main reason why I say that Mathmech is a little worse is because I feel like Bestials are going to be so prevalent in this format. With Dragon Link still being in the meta, I still think Dragon Link is going to be really solid. Druisworm being a really good card, or a decent card against Unchained and, other matchups like Tier Limits, etc, etc. So Salamangreat and Marine Cess, both of them are water and fire, but on the other hand, Math Mech is a light deck, so it does get hit in the crossfire with stuff like Bestials. And being with hand traps not being as well, or not being as good against like Unchained, I guess could make these decks a lot worse, which is why they're in the rogue category. Branded is a solid, like, I would say like tier 3, tier 2 deck. I think it's a gatekeeper deck, I would say. It's one of those decks that if you're not good enough to beat Branded, you're probably not a good deck. Or you're probably not a rogue deck. So, Branded still does what it does best. Open up Branded Fusion. You don't get Ash. You pretty much combo. You still have the Gimmick Puppet lock, which is pretty annoying to have. But overall, I mean, it's just solid overall. I can't really say anything else. I mean, it's just pretty decent. Tier limits. Now, tier limits, I'm gonna have a pretty bold take about tier limits. I feel like tier limits might be the second best deck in the format, but I don't know if it's on the same tier as Unchained. I think tier limits is just so solid, and you see in the OCG. Even though the OCG is not the same as the TCG, I still think that tier limits has so much going for it. The only thing that would make me put this in tier 2 is the rise of Bestials in the main deck, because I feel like a lot of people are going to play Bestials in the main deck just because of Unchained with Druid's Farm, as I said before, and just it has solid matchups overall. Like, even if you can't really get the insane value of Bestials against like something like Tierlament, you're still gonna, summon the Druid's Worm and then link it off on your turn, or if it goes to the graveyard, you send a card from your opponent's field to the graveyard. So, I mean, it's pretty good. I think it's gonna be one of the strongest decks in the format. It's kind of like Unchained, but a little worse because they don't have Kalos and all the, Kaldo Modora, at 3, like before. But I think it's just very, very solid, especially because Fenrir not being banned, it gives you another way to get to the Tierlament's Kashtira, which is just pretty solid. So we're definitely going to see a lot from Tierlament this next upcoming format. The next deck is Mechanico. This is one of those gimmicky rogue decks. It's not bad, but it's not good either. It's just like, if you don't know the matchup, you're going to get OTK'd by it. Otherwise, the deck is just not really that good. I would even put this in trash tier, but it's been topping a couple events, so I guess put it in that category. The next deck is Branded Chimera. I think this is probably a little bit better than Branded. I think Branded Chimera or Chimera Runic, whatever you're playing, whatever Chimera variant you think is the best. I think that Chimera is overall just very solid. It's one of those decks to where it's the same thing as Branded. If you get Ash or you get Impermed or Veiler on your normal summons, or the special summon of one of the illusionist monsters, it could be a rough time. But if they don't, it's pretty hard to beat the deck because it has so much advantage. It just keeps adding cards, rips a card from your hand, pop this card, draw this card. Like, it's just very, very solid. But it's the same thing as something like Branded, but I'd say like maybe a little bit better in that sense. Another deck is Sprite. I think Sprite is pretty solid. I think it's a solid tier 3 deck. I think that Sprite, I don't know, it's really solid. You still have 3 blue, you still have 3 jet, you still have, red, carrot, you still have 2 starter, you still have the nimble stuff, you still have, the Melfi stuff. So I think it's like a pretty solid deck. It's not like too crazy. It's one of those decks where it's not really seen in the meta all that often, but you definitely see this top with the dedicated players to the Sprite Melfi or like the pure Sprite variant. So I think Sprite is definitely very good. Like, the Sprite cards are just way too insane compared to something like Marine Cess. I think Marine Cess is probably a little bit worse. Salamangreat cards are a little bit worse than something like Sprite. And I think that Sprite probably could go second better into Unchained, but I don't know. I think that the end boards are pretty solid and I think the only flaw is the deck going second, but you do have a lot of non-engine to put in your deck, probably about like 12 to 15 going second, something like that, which can help you go second against something like Unchained. So I think Sprite is definitely very solid. Magnetism is a solid rogue deck. I don't think it's that great. The problem with Magnetism is that it relies too much on like some type of combos, like 2-card combos, sometimes maybe 1-card combos, but like overall, it just seems like it loses the Droll. Droll might be in the side decks of a lot of people's decks. So, I mean, Magnetism is just, sometimes you go off, you know, and then the problem with, you know, combo decks in general is that it cannot go second. And if Unchained sets up a board, like, you're not breaking it with Magnetism because the deck is just not that great. Same thing with, like, Tierlist or Labyrinth or, you know, Chimera. If they just go off and something like Magnetism that just doesn't have that many going second cards, or they just playing stuff like Crossout to deal with problematic hand traps, you're going to have a rough time. You're just going to have a rough time. The next deck is Rescue Ace. I think Rescue Ace is definitely a very solid deck. I would say it's a little bit worse. No, I think it's a little bit better than Chimera. I think Chimera is definitely a little bit worse than Rescue Ace. I think Rescue Ace is just very solid, especially because there's not many hand traps in the format because of Unchained. I feel like being able to resolve your Turbulence in set 4 is very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with. And then on top of that, you have, you know, the hand traps like Ash Blossom, Imperm, Nibiru, any other going second cards. Maybe people are still playing books for stuff like Purely. So I think the deck is very solid, and it's pretty consistent. Sometimes it can be a little bit inconsistent, but same thing with a lot of these decks. They're just very sticky, and once they get their combo rolling, it can be very hard to stop. So that's just basically the tier 2, but I feel like what separates Unchained for a lot of these tier 2 decks is that Unchained is just so hard to interact with. But with the tier 2 decks, it's just that they have a little bit of flaws, maybe, you know, 1 to 2 flaws. So, Exosister is a rogue deck. It's pretty solid. Maybe graveyard decks would make this, you know, a tier 3 deck because, you know, it does very well against stuff like Tierlist. It does decent against Lab. It does decent against like these other decks that just touch the graveyard a lot. So Exosisters could be good. I think it's just a solid deck. I mean, we've seen it at the NAWCQ for 2023. So I mean, it won that big tournament. So I mean, and it did win a YCS. It won 2 YCS, by the way. So never underestimate Exosister. It's a super solid deck. Gold Pride Punk. This deck kind of fell off. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's okay, I guess. I mean, it could be a solid like rogue deck at best, but I just don't think it's great. Maybe it can be proven otherwise. It's just like another like combo deck. It's just fine, right? It's just fine. Nothing too crazy though. Nothing too crazy. Dark World. Now, Dark World is pretty scary, especially if people don't play stuff like Droll or like a good amount of hand traps. It's just really hard to beat this, especially with a Rise Hard banned and maybe shifting out of the format. Dark Worlds is seeming like a very insane deck, and I'm gonna say it's probably a tier 2 deck. I don't know where to put this. It's maybe like the top of tier 3, bottom of tier 2. It just depends on people respecting the Dark World deck. I think this deck is very, very insane, and same thing with a lot of these decks, but to an extreme degree. Dark Worlds, once they get going, it is super hard to stop this deck. It is so crazy. There's no way you can break these boards because they're putting up 8 negate. They're probably like ripping your hand. Like, this deck is crazy, and the biggest thing that was holding this deck back is a Rise Heart and Shifter and Droll. 2 of those things are probably not going to be in the format, or if, you know, Droll, probably in the side deck. But if people don't respect Dark Worlds, this could go from tier 3 to like tier 1, tier 2. So I think this deck is like very, very solid. It's just like, again, Shifter, Droll, they're just insane against this deck. Kashtira I think this is a solid tier 3/rogue deck. I think this deck is very solid. A lot of people think that this deck is dead, but you still have Shifter, you still have 3 Fenrir, you still have 3 Field Spell, you still have 3 Birth. Like, this deck is very, very consistent. It could be a solid anti-meta strategy, especially against something like Tier Elements. You have stuff like Shifter, really solid. Dark Worlds, again, they lose the Shifter. You have, you know, all these different staple cards you could play in the Kashtira deck to deal with something like Unchained or Tier Elements or Labyrinth. So I think Kashtira is definitely still very solid. It's just it lost a very, very, very strong win condition. But I still think all the other cards are just too powerful not to respect at some extent. Striker, I mean, Striker is just a rogue deck. I mean, it is what it is. It's decent. It's okay. It's not something too crazy. It still has it doesn't have 3 engage. It's 2 engage, but it has everything else at 3 pretty much, except point and drones. But I don't know. It's just Sky Striker doesn't do much. I don't see how this interacts with anything very well. Like, I don't like Tier Elements. They kind of play through everything. Like, it seems pretty bad. Honestly, it just seems pretty bad. Sword Soul is like a solid rogue deck. I mean, Sword Soul does what it does best. Normal summon Mo Yi, summon Chi Xiao, summon Baron. You know, have a couple of hand traps. You're going 2nd cards. It's solid. Rika, I think Rika is one of those other decks that if people don't respect, if people are not playing hand traps, Rika is so good. It is just one of those combo decks to where if they can play board breakers, and if people are not playing hand traps, this deck can be very, very insane. And especially because Arise Heart is banned, this deck is just very, very solid. It is very, very good. The next deck is Dragon Link. I still think Dragon Link is probably one of the best decks of the format. I think Dragon Link, even though they lost Magnemite, even though they lost Chaos Space, they still have 3 Lubellion, they still have 3 Druid Worm, 3 Suranir, they still have Striker Dragon, they still have the Rockets, they still have the Red Eyes cards. This deck is just super consistent, and it has a pretty solid matchup against Unchained, which helps a lot. And because you're playing Bestials, you beat the tier deck, and Bestials also hurt the Labyrinth deck as well to a certain extent. And it just matches up very well against like pretty much all of these decks. So I think that definitely Dragon Link is going to be one of the better decks. The next deck is Purely. I think Purely is probably somewhere around tier 2/tier 1. It just depends on how much people respect Purely. And why I say that is because the book cards were so insane against the Purely cards. But assuming that people are not going to be playing book cards anymore, I think Purely becomes a solid tier 1 deck. I think this is the 3rd tier 1 deck because this deck just does so much. And Noir is just such an insane card. The only thing that hurt this deck was the Delicious Memory to 1. And because we got the new X Purely Noir, or E Period Noir, it just fixed a lot of those issues. So I think that Purely definitely is going to be a solid tier 1 deck. If not, probably somewhere in the tier 2 category. I think the deck is still very, very good. You're probably going to see 5 to 6 Pureleys in the top cut. Same with like Dragon Link, and then more so with Unchained is going to be like, 16 maybe. So I think this is pretty solid. Floowandereeze is probably one of the better decks, because it does have a pretty solid Unchained matchup as well. I think it's pretty decent. Floowandereeze just does what Floowandereeze does best. She plays Shifter, which counters a lot of decks, as well as being that anti-meta strategy. It has Harpy's Featherstorm. It has the consistency once it gets rolling, I guess. But, like, if it doesn't get rolling, that's, like, the bad part about Floowandereeze is, like, if you get hand-trapped or if you just don't open up combo, it could be pretty bad for the Floowandereeze player. But otherwise, this is just a very solid tier 3 deck that can counter a lot of the tier 1 and tier 2 decks. Drytron is a pretty solid rogue deck, but I feel like if Bestials are still in the format, I mean, it's still like just one of those worst combo decks. I mean, it's just not that great. Bestials are really, really strong, and Drytron just seems like a worse version of something like Dark World or Tier Limits or whatever. it's just not that good. And then you have the bricks of the rituals and stuff like that. It's just not that great. But Drytron is definitely very scary if you don't see a Bestial or a hand trap for this deck. Now, the next deck is Infernobles. Now, I'm gonna put a lot of respect on Infernobles because I feel like a lot of people don't respect Infernobles, which is like a very big mistake, especially if people don't play hand traps. Again, I repeat this again and again. If people are not playing hand traps, or if they're not playing stuff like Dark Ruler, or just some blowout to beat Infernobles like Droplets, this deck can be very scary going second or going first, and even going second. It can play stuff like Board Breakers to help beat stuff like Unchained and Dragon Link and Purely and, you know, Tierlist, etc, etc. I think this deck is going to be very solid. We see it top the last YCS Vancouver because Infernobles with a lot of, you know, all these hand traps like Droll, Imperm, Ogre, Ash, whatever, you know, any Nibiru, like all these hand traps, if they're not seeing play in the format, or if they're seeing at like a less extent, Infernoble is just really solid. And then the last deck is Vanquis. This deck is pretty solid. I think it's a solid rogue deck. I mean, it does what it does best. Normal summon Raisin, you know, have a couple of, you know, hand traps, maybe Shifter, and I mean, you're good to go. You still have 3 Fenrir, which is still a really good reveal for your Earth. And then, you know, we are getting new support. I don't want to talk about the new support yet because I think Agov is still like a month away from the metagame. But I still think Vanquis definitely very solid. It's one of just those anti-meta decks or solid hand trap decks to where you can play a good amount of solid non-engine, and then you just have a good engine to keep rolling and rolling once you get going. So that is it for the tier list. Let me know what you guys think about this tier list. I think overall maybe Unchained is like probably just significantly better than all these other decks, but let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I definitely think that Unchained is definitely going to be somewhat above a lot of the other decks in the format. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. I am out.